Now, changing gears entirely, James May, who is renowned for his roles in Top Gear and the Grand Tour, is making headlines once again. Well known for his dry wit and passion for all things automotive, May has recently announced a live stage tour, which is set to begin later on this year. There are also rumours he's going to be reuniting with former co-hosts Richard Hammond and Jeremy Clarkson for a special episode of the Grand Tour entitled The Not Very Grand Tour. Well, what's true and what's not? Well, we can hear it from May himself, who joins us now from London. James May, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Pleasure.
Lots of rumours about a reunion between you, Jeremy Clarkson, and Richard Hammond. What's true and what isn't?
Well, I'm afraid it's not a reunion. The Not Very Grand Tour is essentially a best-of compilation. Hosted from the studio by me and Richard Hammond. Jeremy Clarkson wasn't available for some reason, but we're all in the clips. It's all things you've seen before, but chopped up in a different way.
You say for some reason. Does that suggest you're not in regular contact with Jeremy Clarkson?
No, we recorded it a while back. To be honest, I can't remember why he couldn't be there. He was probably busy.
Okay, you don't like the idea of comebacks, do you?
Yeah.
You've said about the idea of comebacks in the past. We're not Led Zeppelin, you said. What's wrong with a comeback?
Well, there's nothing wrong with a comeback, and I'm a big fan of Led Zeppelin, but there comes a point where you have to draw a line under it and, you know, as we used to say, land it safely rather than crash it. We've exhausted our take on the subject. It's probably time for a more modern one. And we're already pretty old. So if we did a comeback in 20 years' time, it would be in bath chairs, you know, and I think it would be rather unseemly. So I really don't see it happening.
Yeah, you've said to other media outlets, you're getting on a bit. You say, oh, you're not that old, you're only 62. But do you think the next generation is as interested in fast cars as your generation? I mean, what could the next generation bring to the table, do you think?
In all honesty, no, I don't think they are, on the whole. They have many more distractions and plenty that we didn't have. I think the car has never been at a more interesting time in its evolution, apart from the time when it was invented, I suppose. So there should be lots to say about it, about the way it's being used, the way it's being made, you know, the connectivity of them. But I'm not quite sure how you do it. I mean, I try. I've written a few things about the future of cars and electric cars and so on, but it really takes, I think it will take some people in their 20s or early 30s with a very modern mindset and who can address sort of what you're alluding to, what the interest of today's young is in cars. It's going to be a different angle from the one we had, but I'm sure it must be there somewhere. I can't believe that car TV has come to an end.
Yeah, I mean, you, however, are and have been for a while something of a proponent of, you know, alternative sources of fuel for cars, moving away from combustion engines. I mean, isn't that something that's quite close to your heart and therefore something you could produce and present quite convincingly?
Yes, well, I hope so. The trouble is, I mean, when the internal combustion engine for my generation was what, in a sense, what made cars exciting, because it gave the car a mechanical character. It's a very flawed piece of technology, the internal combustion engine, so it has to be managed carefully. You know, it needs gearboxes, it has to idle, all these things. But we found that exciting, or at least we made it exciting because that's all we had. The problem with electric cars is they have an absolutely uniform mechanical character because they are electric motors. They're smooth and they're quiet and they're very, very easy to use. So you have to get excited about cars, you maybe need to get more excited about styling, the interior comfort, features. I mean, these are things we talked about before, but our sort of appreciation of the car was dominated by engines. But the world can move on. There aren't people now, you know, lamenting the demise of the steam engine, as far as I know.
Not that I'm aware of. But once cars start driving themselves, I mean, you really are out of a job, aren't you, then, when it comes to presenting a car driving show?
Yes. Well, I'm out of a job anyway, to be honest, because it's over. But funnily enough, I was in a self-driving car in California last week, one of the Waymos, and it was actually extremely impressive, if a bit unnerving. But I still think we're quite a long way away from driverless cars being on general sale or leased to the public. I think that's a long way off. It's still very much in the experimental stage, and it's a very complicated problem because you're talking about extremely advanced robotics, and robotics are always disappointing. I'm supposed to have a robot butler by now, but the most I can hope for really is a robotic vacuum cleaner that'll get stuck under the sofa. So I remain a bit cynical. It's fascinating technology, but I don't think it's just around the corner, not for most of us.
Yeah, electric vehicles very much in the headlines all the time, really, for lots of different reasons. There have been some attacks on Tesla cars, Tesla showrooms around the world. I mean, what do you make of all that? I mean, it looks like the brand's been quite politicized, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I have a Tesla. I'm on my second Tesla, in fact, and I can't remember really a time when a car marque was seen as a political weapon or a political enemy. I mean, when I was a child, there were people who wouldn't buy German cars or Japanese cars because of World War II. But they were very old people even then. But it hasn't really happened in my time as a car journalist. And I find it a bit odd, to be honest, because yes, I accept that people have objections to Elon Musk's involvement in American politics, but why is that being taken out on a private individual's car in the UK or anywhere else in the world, for that matter? It strikes me as just pure vandalism or terrorism light. I have to say, nobody's dragged me out of mine yet and taken me to the gallows or anything like that, and nobody's set fire to it or written Nazi on it.
Are you happy with? Are you otherwise quite happy with your Tesla?
Yes, I mean it's not perfect. I really bought it because I feel that if you're a car enthusiast and a car commentator, you have to take an interest in these things. You have to be part of the experiment, and I'm in a fortunate position because I can afford to be. On the whole, I like it, yes, and I like electric cars, but I didn't buy a Tesla because I admired Elon Musk so much. I really admired the work of his engineers, and I bought it as a car, not as a statement.
What about Chinese electric vehicles? They're obviously a bit of a thorn in the side of American and European car manufacturers. I don't know if you've driven any. What do you think of them?
Yes, I've driven a couple of small ones by BYD and so on, and they were really quite good. The Chinese car industry is developing apace, rather like the Japanese one did in the 70s and early 80s. It's coming. I don't think there's anything we can do about it unless you want to tariff them out of existence. But that rarely works well for the motor industry, and it doesn't generally give people better cars.
Okay, just pivoting back to Elon Musk and Tesla for a moment, then we'll move on. Do you think there's perhaps a bit of scope for some collaboration in the future, some sort of a tie-up, perhaps have Elon Musk as a co-presenter on future generations of Top Gear? What do you think?
Well, I think he would be quite biased, to be honest. So I think you would struggle to sell that. I mean, especially if it was on Top Gear on the BBC, I think that would be regarded as against the charter. So no, I suspect he's quite busy anyway. I think the commentators on cars in the future have to be people ideally in their 20s. Who are looking at the world through the eyes of a new generation, and who are its inheritors, and they must be out there somewhere. There are millions and millions and millions of people in the world, and there are still quite a few people who are interested in cars and the whole transport picture. Somewhere amongst those, you need 3 or 4 that can be put together to make a TV show. I don't believe it's that difficult.
You've tried your hand at other things as well as presenting TV shows. You've got a country pub, the Royal Oak, in the west of England. That's a tough business, isn't it, running a pub?
Yes, I mean, I don't actually run it. We have a manager, and yes, it is extremely difficult to run a pub. I mean, we've just had to put up with, from yesterday, increases in the minimum wage, national insurance contributions, energy costs have gone up, everything's basically going up, insurance is going up. And the pub is actually very successful, it's very popular, but it still only just survives. And to be honest, that's partly because it's not tied to a brewery, so it doesn't have to pay anything back to the brewery. And it's owned by me and another man called Simon, who don't take anything out of it. So they don't have to satisfy the needs to pay a dividend to shareholders or anything like that. The pub is really, well, we'll have to regard it as a community service, I suppose. It pays the people who work for it very well and on time, which is as much as you can hope for, really. But I didn't buy the pub because I thought it was going to be a great money spinner. I didn't want it to shut, because it's close to my country cottage. There wouldn't be a nearby pub if that one had shut. And owning a pub is a nice feeling, to be honest. A lot of us dreamt of it when we were younger. And a lot of people say, oh, I'd love to own a pub. A lot of people think they can run a pub, but it's actually extremely difficult. And I wouldn't recommend going into it unless you are a professional in the hospitality industry. The hours are long and quite antisocial. There's every opportunity to get fat and drunk. The pay is not that brilliant, to be honest, and it's a struggle to keep those things open.
Jeremy Clarkson's got a pub as well. What's the difference in style, would you say, as you as a pub landlord and him?
Mine's much better. I think that's the main difference. I haven't actually been to Jeremy's pub. I've met a few people who have. It sounds like... well, from what I can gather, he's gone for a sort of mass throughput model. So he's got, hundreds of people queuing up to have his burger, whereas ours is a little bit more relaxed. It's a village pub where people come. The food is great. We've got a fabulous team of chefs. So mine would feel more like a regular English pub. It's not old-fashioned. It hasn't got horse brass on the walls or any of that twee stuff. There's no Morris dancing. I won't allow that. But it is just a pub.
OK, I mean, you say your pub's much better, and you make lots of jokes about Jeremy Clarkson and Richard Hammond. Of course, there was really great chemistry between the three of you, the sort of 20-plus years you spent working together. And, you're quoted as saying, I spent a third of my life with those two idiots. But when we hear you say things like that, we should take them with a good dose of affection, shouldn't we?
Yes, I mean, that is the British way, I'm afraid, when you work closely with people or you're, in the army or something like that. There is a lot of ribbing. It's a sign of acceptance in Britain, especially amongst British men. You are the most horrible to the people who you rely on the most.
What about something for the future that you might do next? I mean, obviously you've ruled out a comeback on Top Gear, but we are moving more away from TV shows, perhaps more towards podcasts. Might a podcast be a good idea for a James May comeback?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a few other things to do. I'm doing my Live Explorers show, and I'm doing some more stuff for Discovery and Channel 5, and I honestly thought I was going to retire this year, and this year has turned out to be the busiest I've had for quite a few. Quite a few people have asked me to do a podcast, but I'm not sure I have the strength left for it, to be honest, because the people who suggest it think it's easy, that you just stick a microphone on like this one that's in front of me now and a recorder, and you just talk away and millions of people will subscribe to it and think it's brilliant. But I don't think it's that simple. I think podcast is a bit like radio and your sort of television. It consumes a massive amount of material and you've got to keep coming up with it. And I don't think I've got the strength.
OK, I've got another idea. I've got another idea for you. Your childhood career dream was to be an astronaut, I'm told. If that's not true, do correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that was Jeremy. No, Jeremy said he wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to be a fighter pilot.
You didn't want to be an astronaut?
No, not particularly.
OK.
I wanted to be a fighter pilot, which is sort of related.
My producer swears you wanted to be an astronaut, and I'm wondering whether perhaps how you'd have felt for those astronauts who were stuck on the International Space Station, and whether you thought you'd have managed being stuck up there in space for a few months with Jeremy Clarkson and Richard Hammond.
No, I think that would have been pretty disastrous, to be honest, because it's a confined space. I suspect weightlessness for an extended period makes you quite bad-tempered after a while. The food is not that exciting, is there? And there's no bar. So I don't think that would suit us in the slightest. We're
Okay.
very much a gravity-inspired trio.
All right. Well, you're best known for sure for your car shows and your travel shows. So, best car out there, what is it?
Oh, people ask me this all the time, and I never know the answer. I mean, I'm secretly a bit of a fan of mid-engine Ferraris. And I have one, a 458 Speciale, which was probably the greatest car I ever drove, or I thought was the greatest car I drove when I was working on the car show, so I bought one. I'm also a massive fan of small, simple things like the Fiat Panda, old Minis, the Toyota Aygo, anything small and simple. I'm not really an SUV type person. I find them slightly absurd for most people's lives and uses. I don't really quite know where that fad has come from. But I mean, if I had to choose a car, as they used to say in England, to see me out, so it's just one car that does everything, for the rest of my life, to be honest, it would probably be a Golf, because I think the answer to most automotive questions is the VW Golf. And there you go, you see, that's quite interesting, because nobody is setting fire to VW dealerships or vandalizing Golfs by writing Nazi on them, but you're driving a car from a company that was quite literally founded by Hitler.
You make a very good point there. You've got, of course, some of the cars that you just mentioned in your collection. I'm talking about that Ferrari and the Fiat Panda, I'm told you still own, but maybe you don't, maybe you've sold it. I mean, is there a thread to your collection of cars? You've got quite a lot of them, and you know, if you're going from a Ferrari to a Fiat Panda, I mean, that's quite a range, isn't it?
Yes, they're virtually indistinguishable, to be honest. I don't know. There isn't it's not really a car collection. I've just ended up with too many cars. There isn't a theme, apart from that I've avoided boredom, I think. Although sometimes the idea of a very, very boring car is quite appealing. Something like the old VW Jetta. It's a car so utterly anonymous that it's actually quite admirable, because it simply functions as a car and displays nothing else and ekes out of you no emotion whatsoever, either love or hatred or anything in between. There's nothing there when you drive a VW Jetta, and I quite admire that.
Yeah, you live in London. You obviously don't like driving in London, and obviously where you drive a car means, you know, what you're going to get out of that car. And as you say, you don't like driving in London. Have you ever driven in the Middle East? I think you have. Tell us about
Yes,
that.
I have. I've driven in. I've definitely driven in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and a little bit. Well, we have driven through bits of Jordan, bits of Iraq. I have been to Egypt quite a bit, but I haven't driven there. I think that's about it, actually, for my Middle East driving experience.
What do you make of the driving style in the Middle East?
Well, as far as I remember, it was pretty good. I mean, the country with the most terrifying driving, it used to be Spain years ago, but they've become very sensible now. Some South American countries I've been in have had some pretty random driving, but I seem to remember that the driving in the Middle East seemed quite restrained on the whole. Also, I believe the police are quite tough on bad driving, aren't they?
They certainly are. Yeah, you don't want to have too many traffic infractions here. Moving on from
It's quite big.
moving on from cars to travel shows. I mean, is there a country that stands out for you, or a region that stands out for you as being, you know, right up there, top of the list?
Well, I have always been a massive fan of Japan, which is why I wanted to make that original one. I just find aesthetically, Japan is fascinating, because, you know, all the details, everything about it is just amazing to look at, and it's very meticulously organized. So that stands out. I mean, I'm not making any more travel shows. Amazon don't want those anymore, and to be honest, they're quite grueling to make. But I would have loved to have done the Middle East. We had one planned for the US, and we had one planned for South America, just loosely sketched out. And I find most places you go are pretty fascinating once you start talking to the people there, because that's actually what makes places. Architecture and food and so on is all very well, but it's actually mixing with people that makes the experience of traveling rewarding. And people are interesting everywhere.
They are. And just looking at what we're going to see from you next and where we might see you next, you're doing this stand-up live show. You go on tour later this year. Just tell us a bit about what that show is all about.
It's called Exploration from the Ice Age to the Space Age, which turns out to be an enormous subject to cover in one evening. But it's essentially a theatre stage show presented by me with audio-visual things and a few special effects and so on. We're actually still working on it. I've been working on the script earlier today. So it goes around Australia, New Zealand, and then Singapore, and then later in the year it's going to come to Britain for a stint. And if it works and people like it, we may then continue it into other bits of the world. But basically, if you come, I hope people do, it sort of addresses the philosophy of exploration and the mindset and why humanity has done it. And we've always done it, and we all do it individually at a very small level. Some people take it to extremes, and they, completely change the face of the world by colonization, discovery, trade, all these things. So it's not the whole story, because, as I said, it's enormous. But we've sort of plucked out a few good uns, a few bangers, as da kids would say, and those will all go into the performance. But as I say, we're still very much working on the script, so I can't tell you exactly what's in it yet.
Okay, we wouldn't want to spoil it. Just before we wrap up, I've been told by one of my producers to ask you your thoughts on the new Dacia Sandero. What do you have to say about that, Mr. May?
The old one, the first and second ones, I was always a big fan of, because it was one of those, I don't think it is anymore, but it was the cheapest new car in Britain, which when I was a lad was always something sort of Soviet, like a Lada or a Moscovich. And to be honest, they were a bit ropey. But the Sandero was really an old Renault Clio with a different body on. And Dacia is actually part of Renault. And it was a pretty good car. It was quite basic, but it was a good car at a very low price. Now, it started to, as with all these things, it started to grow a bit, and all cars are growing too much. They're becoming too bloated and too wide and so on. But it's still pretty appealing. And Dacia now make the Spring, which I drove a few weeks ago, which is not only at the moment the cheapest new car available in Britain, it's also electric. And, for a long time, people have been saying electric cars are all very well, but they're too expensive. But now the cheapest new car you can buy is an electric one. So I suppose now we'll find out if people actually want them.
Sure. And just to wrap up, we're out of time. But do you think basically we are at the end of the road for cars and car ownership as we've known them throughout our lives, James?
In some ways, yes. I think we've arrived at a time when we have to reassess the car and how we use it. Now, I say this as someone who loves cars because I do, but I feel we should use them with discretion and carefully, so that they are not ultimately taken away from us, not by the man or government or anything like that, but by the weight of public opinion. I don't think cars are very effective in towns and cities. I think they're actually a great way of getting between them. But around town, they're clutter. And I don't drive in London if I can possibly avoid it. The only time I take the car into London is if I've got to collect something really big, like a vase or a dining chair or something. The rest of the time I use public transport and bicycles, because to be honest, it's quicker.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. If you're ever in the Middle East, I do hope we'll be able to persuade you to come and talk to us in our studios. James May, British TV host, thank you very much.
Thank you.